Good afternoon and welcome again to Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm your host, Chris Whitehead, and today we're talking about an important topic and one, frankly, that I think doesn't get enough attention, and that's how project financing affects getting decarbonization projects built and what types of challenges have we faced over the past 18 months, couple of years now in doing these projects. And frankly, too, what types of support projects and infrastructure are needed to get these ambitious goals achieved? And are those getting the attention that they actually deserve? And I started this podcast to talk about environmental justice and sustainability and climate change goals. And frankly, none of those get achieved or get as much accomplished as possible if you don't get the financing right. And we have two experts here with us today to talk about how projects get done from various perspectives, from small startups, new technologies, and then large support infrastructure that's critical to decarbonization and offshore wind development. The types of things and the types of first movers that are often difficult in industry. And it takes innovative thought and being willing to collaborate and put yourself out there a little bit to get these types of things done. So honestly, with that, I think I'm going to pause and bring on our two experts. Today we have Jonathan Kennedy from Clean Energy Terminals and John May from Hamilton Clark. If you can guys please come on camera. Hey, afternoon. How are you guys?
Hey Chris, very well.
Very well. Thank you,
Thanks for
Chris.
having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm excited to chat with both of you. But first, before we get started into the content, I wanted to actually offer you each an opportunity to just give a little bit of background on yourselves, possibly what your companies are doing, and then how they actually pertain to the decarbonization goals that I was talking about earlier. So, I don't know, perhaps Jonathan first.
Yeah, happy to, and thank you again for inviting me on the show. So I'm with a company called Clean Energy Terminals. My role with CET is a Chief Development Officer. CET is a private equity-backed port developer. Specifically, it's kind of clues in the name, Clean Energy Terminals, but we focus in particular on offshore wind ports. And really, we're looking to build a portfolio of offshore wind ports across North America in the next, say, decade or so. And really, the genesis of CET kind of comes from a few realizations. I guess one that to date, offshore wind ports haven't seen kind of large private capital deployed like we're seeing in other infrastructure sectors, and we think that's a missed opportunity. We think there's an opportunity to leverage private capital, just as we do in toll roads and social infrastructure and airports. Wind ports shouldn't be any different, but that's not happening yet. And one of the kind of purposes of CET is to turn these projects into projects that investors will get behind. Second realization, Chris, is that you can't have offshore wind without offshore wind ports. And, developers have enough on their plates. Wind developers have enough with transmission, with the wind farms. We can't be expecting wind developers to also build out the port infrastructure that they need. That's not their core business. They build wind farms at the end of the day. So there's a gap there, right? Someone needs to fill that gap. Someone needs to step in and say, okay, well, we're going to build out the port infrastructure, this enabling infrastructure. And we can't necessarily expect wind developers to do that. And the third piece really is that, you have to build ports, you have to build all infrastructure, frankly, the right way. But when you're talking about in-water infrastructure, there's environmental sensitivities. Oftentimes there's community-related sensitivities. So it really takes a special set of skills. It takes experience with community engagement, with environmental regulations, with government engagement to make sure that we're building these projects kind of the right way. And that means union labor, community benefit agreements, minority, women-owned business targets, etc. Because if we don't do it the right way, you're not going to get the support, you're not going to get the community support for these projects. And again, at the end of the day, if CT and the industry more broadly doesn't succeed in building out these ports, there is no offshore wind. That's the fact.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point to hammer home too. And just a little bit of background for the audience. Jonathan and I have strong ties in New Jersey, but I think, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, we first started talking most when I was doing the project, actually looking at the intersection of offshore wind ports and environmental justice and the impacts those can have. And I was always encouraged and frankly impressed by the interest that you showed in the topic.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. And likewise, we've enjoyed working with you in past roles and in this current role because again, it's all about building infrastructure projects the right way. You have to kind of build the respect of your host communities, and that's kind of what CAT is about. And again, if we don't do it the right way, you're not going to get the buy-in that we need. And if we don't bridge the gap in ports, then we don't realize the $660 billion economic opportunity that is US offshore wind, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, John, you're coming at this from another perspective and are involved in different things, but some common themes there as well. So if you want to give a little bit of background on yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Um, I'm an investment banker and I work for a firm called Hamilton Clark Sustainable Capital. And what we do primarily is raise equity and first commercial scale project financing for early stage technology companies in sustainability and decarbonization broadly. Um, so many of the investment bankers at the firm started out in the solar and wind space 20 years ago. I started out in the biofuel space doing ethanol and biodiesel. And then I moved to sustainable aviation fuels and more recently to hydrogen, ammonia, methanol. But really, every sector in every industry needs to be decarbonized at some point to some extent. And the thing I am really pleased about in terms of participating with you, Chris, and Jonathan, is this notion of environmental justice. The way I interpret that is this. I interpret it through the lens that I see every day. And what I see every day, and I want to be frank with your audience, is that the institutional investors like private equity, venture capital, environmental, social, and governance funds like the Gates Breakthrough Ventures, and a host of infrastructure funds that I'm sure Jonathan and you are familiar with. What I'm seeing, particularly this year, and I've been doing this since 2003, and at Hamilton Clark, I've been doing it since 2017. And what I'm seeing is that the people that you would think would be responsible for making decisions about deploying capital for early stage companies are, in some sense, resisting that and saying, we are concerned about the technology scale up of various technologies, whether it's in the power sector, the fuel sector, the gas sector. And so what we're seeing this year is that projects and technologies that in prior years would have been very interesting to and even fascinating to private equity and venture capital. And what we're seeing this year is nobody wants to stick their neck out and take risk of any kind. So that's really a sea change in the mentality that we've grown to understand when it comes to venture and private equity investing. And I think that does not bode well for the future. I want to talk later in the broadcast about first of a kind risk and how you can de-risk first of a kind risk with something called technology risk insurance, which I think is in some sense an antidote to this behavior we're seeing from private equity and venture capital, where the technology risk insurance is relatively inexpensive and a developer can bring that insurance in and thus give private equity and venture capital an opportunity to get back some of their money in the event that the project is a failure for some unknown reason, which is typically something that happens only very rarely, but still causes a lot of concern when it does.
I think that's all actually very, very interesting, and I agree. I want to get to that, but I think what might be valuable first, if we can both spend a minute or so talking about how project financing comes into play for getting for getting a new project off the ground. And you both are active in sectors that are trying different things, might not have supply chain established, or in Jonathan's case, you're trying to build that support infrastructure. How how heavy of a lift is that? And how long of a time scale are you committing to when you say, okay, I'm gonna stick my neck out a little bit and try and go forward on a project?
Yeah, I can tackle that one first. So, if we just boil project finance down, what we're talking about is non-recourse finance right now. We're talking about, we're talking about kind of high leverage, high gearing ratios. We're talking about kind of using debt efficiently, effectively to make the cost of capital of the project come down so that the project pencils. Now, it's a great, vehicle for financing good projects. The challenge with project finance, given it's non-recourse, is you have to convince lenders that all risks have been identified, everything has been mitigated or can be managed, right? And most critically, you have to convince lenders and yourselves, frankly, that every risk has been allocated to the party best able to manage and bear that risk. So these are kind of fundamental tenets of project finance that have been known for decades, right? And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of project case studies that kind of show where things went wrong, and oftentimes it comes down to kind of the contractual and financial structure of the project. So the challenge with project finance in industries like offshore wind ports is that there's so many variables outside of parties' control that it makes financing on a non-recourse basis very difficult. Because, and to give you an example, in the case of offshore wind ports are an extension of offshore wind projects in a way that the revenue sources for offshore wind ports are offshore wind projects. Now, the developer of an offshore wind port has no control over the offshore wind project, and that project is itself dealing with 1,000 variables. Now, if one of those variables plays out in the wrong way and that wind project is delayed, or the economics of it alter and the developer decides not to proceed, the port has lost its revenue. So project financing, and we can get into this in a little bit later, is kind of the solution, we think, to bridging the wind port gap. But there's a host of things we're going to have to do to get wind ports to a place where they become bankable, right? You can get high gearing, you can convince lenders to put money in. I think we can get there. And again, I think the kind of the lessons and learnings we can borrow from other infrastructure sectors. I think project finance is kind of the solution here. But we've got a bit of work to do to kind of get these projects into shape so that they become project financeable.
Interesting. Interesting. John?
Well, I just wanted to add I guess a couple things to what Jonathan already said, and dig into it more because I think it'll be meaningful for the listeners. So when I think of solar and wind, I think these are industries that have been around for 20 years, and there's not a huge scale-up risk. I don't want to take the words out of Jonathan's mouth, but there's not a huge scale-up risk. Most of what we're seeing in an area like hydrogen is a good example. everybody wants to jump into the hydrogen industry, but there's 14 different ways to make hydrogen. There are all these different colors, right? What feedstock are you going to use, and is it available, and how much does it cost? So I guess the whole thing is the developer in hydrogen, to use this as an example, has to spend the time necessary to understand exactly how they're going to make the hydrogen, what the feedstock is, and then all these variables have to be worked out. And sometimes if a technology developer has invented their own way of making hydrogen, and we see a number of these people, they need to raise equity through Hamilton Clark at the corporate level just to get their technology to a technical readiness level of 7, 8, or 9 on a scale of 10, so that it's ready to be deployed at commercial scale for the first time. And so this goes back to my earlier point. If the private equity and venture capital and other fund investors in the institutional investor market are not willing to take the risk along with the technology company / developer to evolve the technology over time and get it to a TRL 7, 8, or 9 so they can do a first commercial scale project financing, the entire system collapses. Because the essential capital, in my sense, and I want Jonathan to talk about his case, but the entire sort of intellectual infrastructure for decarbonization technologies of all kinds is starting out in a lab, then doing a pilot, and then getting the pilot to expand to a point where it's at TRL 7, 8, or 9, and then doing a first commercial scale project, which involves raising development equity to pay for front-end engineering design and other pre-FID items. And finally, then, only then, years later, are we ready to do the first commercial scale project financing. And the ultimate comeuppance for the industry is that many of these first commercial scale projects, once they happen, don't work perfectly. That's why the technology risk insurance is so valuable. Otherwise, it would be even worse from the standpoint of private equity and venture capital. They would say we have no recourse at all other than just to foreclose. And with the insurance policy can provide capital to the developer using the technology to try to get it fixed and make it work. But that illustrates the interests of a variety of different players that have to come together in the space. And it all adds up together to what you call, Christopher Whitehead, environmental justice. And all of those pieces need to be working together in order for us to decarbonize in an accelerated fashion. And I'm talking about planet-wide now.
Now that's interesting, and I'm gonna touch on that in a second, but before I do, you both kind of implied that for various reasons, outside forces, like again, I'm just gonna go with this a simple example, supply chain or interest rates going up over the past couple of years can really mess with your perceived risk at the time you started a project. And I'm not going to have this focus solely on offshore wind, but I'll just toss a general one out there. Have enough lessons been learned over the last 2 years that the same mistakes or the same outcomes are not just going to happen again? Or things like tying in inflation, or I'm not an expert in finance, so I'm not sure where exactly I'm going here, but are we better off now and know more on how to structure these agreements than we did, say, hypothetically 3 years ago?
Yeah, in the context of wind, offshore wind, 100%. Like I wouldn't say we're there. I think it's still evolving, right? I mean, Europe has been doing offshore wind projects since 1993. Here in the US, we're just starting. We're chapter one of a weighty tome, right? Already we've kind of learned and applied those learnings. State regulators are kind of getting smarter each solicitation. We learn from the one before. I don't think things are kind of perfect, and what have we learned? Well, we've learned, about ultimately we've learned, and it kind of, again, this is something that we learned in other infrastructure sectors a long time ago, but it's about risk allocation, right? If you take a kind of zero sum approach to risk allocation, and your kind of maximum risk transfer is kind of your approach, and the party that's taking it can't necessarily control it, then there's an opportunity for things to go very wrong, right? And I think governments are kind of understanding that, and they're starting to kind of trend towards maybe risk share where it makes sense, where it's value for money for taxpayers and ratepayers. And ultimately it's kind of, you just have to step back and say, well, what can a wind developer control? So construction, delivery, operation, that is all well within a developer's control, right? That's entirely on them. They will take that risk. They know how to do this stuff. But when you introduce variables like permitting timeframes, which they don't control, and kind of supply chain risks that they don't control, and you layer in things like local content and other things, which are good things. I'm not saying we shouldn't have local content. It's a great policy, but it does introduce complexity for the folks building these wind farms, because it's yet another variable that then they don't control. So
Sure.
in answer to your question, Chris, I think like we in the US, and this is a global problem. This isn't unique to the US. Projects in Europe are being paused and terminated. So, this isn't unique to the US. I think governments everywhere are kind of getting smarter. I don't think we're necessarily where we need to be just yet, but, I don't think we're far off. And if you look at the macro environment, I mean, interest rates are coming down 50 basis points recently. There's probably a couple more, reductions ahead of us, towards the end of 24. And if you look at the impact of just interest rates on offshore wind, so between 2019 and 2023, cumulative interest rate rises accounted for about 60% of the increase in the LCOE for US offshore wind projects. So,
Wow.
things are getting better. I think that we're not quite where they need to be. It's not perfect, but, I think we're coming out the other side of where we've been in terms of COVID effects and war effects and steel prices and other things. So, the macro outlook is definitely on the up.
Interesting. And John, I want you to answer that as well, but I'm going to toss on a adder on yours because you focus a lot of times on startup technologies. Does the increased variability also equate to a larger percentage of these technologies and these companies not lasting as long as they may have if we didn't have the variability?
No, I think that exactly what Jonathan described works across all sectors in renewables and decarbonization. I think that the important thing is to try to decarbonize using some sort of technology, and the only way to do that is to invent the technology yourself or use a technology like wind or solar that's been around for a while, and then start to decarbonize. As a financier, as a project finance banker, what's hard for me is to make sure that I raise the capital that's needed to pay for the engineering and design of something like a wind project. And then ultimately, after the thing is engineered and designed, it has to be built. And so I have to raise the money for it to be built. So there are two separate phases. And I want Jonathan to talk about the timing, but it seems to me that most project financings, if you look at the holistic journey, you're talking about a multi-year journey, probably. It takes at least 6 months. That's about as quick as we can, as an investment bank. When we go out and raise equity at the corporate level, it typically takes 6 months from start to finish. You prepare, pitch book materials, you prepare a financial model, you have a whole data room full of information about offtake agreements, incentives that you qualify for, and all the economics are very, very well spelled out. But it takes a while. It takes most early stage companies And even licensees of firms like UOP Honeywell or Halder Topsoe, who will license their technology to a third party developer, and there's a limited warranty that comes with that. But still, the developer is not somebody that's been in the hydrogen space or the wind space for 20 years. Very often they're new to the space or relatively new to it, and they're attracted to it, but they need the time to raise the capital. And it's a ponderous sort of series of financings that have to be done. And rarely is it accomplished within a 2-year period of time. And then another thing we should talk about is really the cost. The cost of these projects, and I'll turn it back to you guys. Just for example, in the hydrogen sector, a small project would be $200 million. There are projects in the hydrogen sector right now that we're seeing are close to $500 million. And that's just the construction financing. That's not the development equity. So this gives you an idea of how important the concept of environmental justice is to the roles of the developer, the investment banker, and the investors all collaborating in a way that allows for us to get on with decarbonization.
No, that's interesting. I obviously like too how you're trying to focus on that topic because I think it's important for a lot of reasons. But I also wonder too, because we're talking about a lot of large numbers, a lot of moving pieces and parts here, and lots of different types of projects that are at various stages. At what point does a developer of any project or any technology feel comfortable enough to take that project public and say, hey, we're gonna have 1,000 jobs here, we're gonna have this or that? I would think if there's still significant risk or potential for the variability, there might be a little hesitation to make that type of announcement or that type of a commitment.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in infrastructure, it's exactly as John describes for technology, right? You've got kind of three phases to an infrastructure project. You've got your development phase, which is kind of taking a project from like an idea on a napkin to something that can be constructed. Then you've got the construction phase, and then you've got the operations phase, right? And typically the operations phase is broken in two. You have kind of a revenue ramp up phase, let's say 5 to 7 years post construction completion, and then long-term operations. And different types of capital like to play at different phases. But as John describes with technology, with infrastructure, with wind ports, with what we're trying to do, it's not dissimilar. We're having to take development risk. So we're using equity to pay for development. Now, we don't bring in project financing until the project is ready to be constructed, right? We self-fund development, and then we project finance construction, and then you refinance when you're through the ramp-up period to long-term. Probably you flip from senior debt to bonds. The challenge though is that even though, and I should explain the timing for a typical wind port is you're looking at 4 to 6 years of development and 2 years of construction, right? They're long term, so that's a lot of time and a lot of development that you've got to incur. Now you're only going to incur that, frankly, if you can look forward and say, I'm confident that I'm going to eventually, I or someone else will eventually get project financing for this project, to justify putting in the development. So you kind of have to, you can't just ignore the construction phase and say, we're just solving to develop them. We're just going to get this project permitted, designed, engage the community, get a license from the community to build, etc. And then get to, you're ready to construct and the thing isn't financeable. You have to know now that in 6, 7 years, this project will be financeable. So it's a challenge for the reasons, Chris, I kind of outlined, that with conventional infrastructure, the universe of variables that you have to try and model and understand. Or let's take an airport, right? I have to build it, I have to get it permitted, And now airports, typically governments will take permit risk. They'll guarantee permits for whoever's building the airport. So the person building the airport just has to find finance. They have to oversee the construction. They have to know that they can deliver this thing on time. And they have to deal with, the tenants. They have to know that it's commercially viable. They have to lock in airlines. They have to model out concession revenue, throughput, operating costs. That's the stuff they do. They do well. But imagine if the planes that were landing at the airport were themselves part of bigger projects out there, wind projects in our case. And if those projects themselves have problems, there are no airlines, there are no planes using the airport, right? That's kind of what a wind port is like, in that, you've got variables outside of the universe of the project that you don't control. And it means that kind of, when it comes to revenue risk for these large projects, these large marshalling projects, it's very hard to look forward and say, okay, in 6 or 7 years, I can pick a day when the revenue tap turns on, because, in the next 7 years, the entity that is bringing revenue to your project has to get its project permitted, has to keep its project economical, has to build its wind farm. And if any of those things don't happen, you don't have any revenue.
Sounds like a lot of uncertainty, and I just have to wonder. I have to wonder, frankly, how all of this comes together ultimately, because obviously we have all these state climate goals, all these federal decarbonization ledges, all great things to strive for, but does each project have to have a mix of both government and private funding to go forward, and how does that look?
Yeah, so I'll go first, and then John, I'll pass back to you because I'm probably talking too much. But the there's two things, Chris. I think, like, I've kind of outlined the problem, and look, CT's in the solutions business, right? You kind of probably wondering, well, why are you building wind ports given all of this? It's because we can see a way forward, right? This is ultimately solvable. And the way to solve it, there's two levers that government have at their disposal. One is grant funding. So if a project is, $1 billion, you're not going to get $1 billion of private capital with all of the risks circling around. So government's going to have to bring the capital stack down with grant funding, with non-dilutive capital. The other lever, now that means, okay, well, that means we're only raising X debt instead of Y debt. But it hasn't solved the revenue risk profile of the project, right? That's still the issue. So we have to solve that also. Now, we think the way to potentially solving that is a partial revenue guarantee. And this model has been used in other infrastructure sectors. And it's effectively, the government saying, okay, if you're going to put hundreds of millions of dollars down to build a wind port so that these wind projects can happen on time and we can transition and achieve our clean energy targets, and one of those projects is late or terminates, we will cover the debt service on your port until the next project turns up and uses your port. So it's basically like a backstop that covers, at least the debt piece. And then that will allow us and others to go to the debt markets and say, well, if the revenue doesn't pan out as we currently think it will, because permits and other things are so hard to predict, the government steps in and covers the debt service. That's kind of one way that we could solve that. And what would that do? That would unlock billions, tens of billions of dollars potentially of private capital that would then, be mobilized to invest in wind ports. And, just to put the scale of the problem on the table, it's $36 billion is what we need to invest in wind ports in the next 10 to 15 years. 36 billion is what this country is going to have to find to build enough wind ports to unlock 660 billion of investment in offshore wind. So, with these settings, grant funding to bring down the capital stack, revenue guarantee to bring down the revenue, to improve the revenue risk profile, I think a big proportion of that 36 billion that we need could be private finance, could be project finance.
Interesting.
that's but it's not going to be all private. Again, you're going to have public grants and subsidies.
And by the way, I had to smile at the permits engineering comment you had in there because that's the aspect we're involved in. And having done a couple of these projects in the past, just the emission calcs themselves can take 8 months. But John, does that backstop model that Jonathan was talking about have anything in common, or do you like any commonalities with the insurance model you were talking about beforehand?
Yes and no. It's a good question, and I'll answer it this way. A model that I think all of your listeners would be familiar with in the U.S. is the U.S. Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which is run by the great Jigar Shah. And I presume if Harris wins, he'll still be there. He's a brilliant guy. And I think what we see out of the DOE is, and I'm going to apply this to my situation, but also to Jonathan's too, is if the federal government and the person of the DOE, the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office, is going to basically say, whether it's a sustainable aviation fuel project or a hydrogen project or a wind project or a solar project, we're going to basically underwrite, meaning provide the capital for these projects from the federal government. And the way that's done, for the nerds out there that want to know the answer to this, is that when you get a loan guarantee from either the Department of Energy or the United States Department of Agriculture, which are the two primary loan programs offices in the U.S., the agencies both use the federal funds bank interest rate as the basis upon which they provide the capital. So they're using the cheapest capital, the capital that the government has to pay when the government issues bonds, like treasuries. So to some extent, decarbonization strategies can be accomplished with the help of the federal government in whatever country they're in, because they can use the government's cost of capital, which is much lower than 7, 8, 9+% debt. Or if it's bond debt, it might be a lower interest rate. But in either case, you're using private debt in those situations. And again, I think that we have to look at each individual asset class, whether it's wind or solar or biofuels or hydrogen or whatever we're talking about in terms of decarbonization technologies, and say, what's the best approach? And do we need the government to play a role in standing up these individual sectors and industries that are deploying first of a kind technologies? And that should be a combination of public policy decision making, as well as, to use Jonathan as an example, what are the wind and solar developers saying they need? What capital are they having a hard time raising? It's not tax equity, which is typically I'll let Jonathan talk about that, but tax equity is typically what solar and wind uses to do the actual project financing, but you can't use tax equity for the pre-project development phase. So I'll turn it back to Jonathan.
Yeah, look, I think all of the options need to be on the table, John. I think that the option you've hit on, which is kind of, I guess government serving as a lender to the project. I think like a challenge there, for at least for wind ports, is there's no obvious debt pool, at the federal level for wind ports, right? There's energy office lending for vessels. There's energy office lending for technologies, but there isn't right now a pool of capital that they could deploy toward ports. There's certainly not wind ports. And then you talk to the Department of Transport, and they don't have kind of fit for purpose lending tools. They have grant tools through MARAD, which are great. They've been a great help. They've deployed hundreds of millions of dollars in recent years to wind ports. but they don't have existing landing programs that would fit offshore wind ports. So offshore wind ports, because they're infrastructure, but they're kind of technologically adjacent. They're kind of in between Department of Energy and DOT, and that's kind of been a bit of an issue. So I think a kind of fit for purpose landing program at a federal level, that for which wind ports would be able to apply, I think would be a great thing. Again, though, I would suspect that the revenue risk profile of some of these projects will be a challenge even for government lenders, right? Because they're going to want to get their money back, and you have to convince them that the revenue will arrive on time. So I'm not sure. I'd be interested, John, to what extent a government lender takes a different view of revenue risk to a private lender. Is their risk appetite higher, or do they apply the same level of kind of debt service cover ratios and other things that a senior lender, a senior debt lender would require?
I think that it depends on the government. I don't mean to try to escape the question, but depends on. I mean, I'm assuming that Jonathan, that the situation in the UK and in Western Europe is such that there isn't the land that you have in the US to do wind and solar anywhere you want to at any one point in time. You have a limited amount of space. And so doing the offshore wind is so much more important to UK, Europe. And yet it's much more technically complicated than any onshore wind or solar would be, as you know better than I do. So it seems to me that that would be a situation where a government minister would have to make a decision about how much of this, the same way that Jiggershaw does at DOE, how much of this should the government pay for or underwrite with a loan guarantee, and how much should be left to the developer to find from the private sector investors, such as private equity, venture capital, ESG, impact funds, and infrastructure funds, like Macquarie's Renewable Infrastructure Fund. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Yeah.
Now, that is very helpful for a lot of reasons, but I wanted to switch over a little bit to slightly a slight variation here. We've been talking obviously a lot on finance because that's the topic of this episode. And Jonathan was highlighting the fact that there is a potential roughly 20x return on offshore wind port development. And that's great. But that
But just
alone,
20x economic return,
exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
not
Yes.
not a 20x financial return. No.
Sorry, I should have specified that. But there's also obviously environmental benefits that could also be monetized or mapped out or folded into that number. So what my question is for both of you, at what point do you try to make that case? And does trying to sell the environmental benefits of a project help get financing for that project?
I'll take a quick stab at that first, Jonathan, and say that it's a fascinating question because, Christopher, because every day I go on LinkedIn, there are announcements of projects basically saying we have sold carbon credits into the voluntary carbon credit market. And I know you guys know this because you read the same things I do. Bill Gates and Breakthrough Ventures have been buying a huge portion of the carbon credits over the last year, or at least from what I can see on LinkedIn and on the internet. And I've gotten to know a few sort of gurus in the carbon credit space just through LinkedIn and going to conferences. I still think the whole carbon credits space is evolving. It's just really in this embryonic stage. And I think there are real worries on the part of developers that want to make use of the carbon credits. Can we qualify for the carbon credits when we send the carbon credit out to be monetized, meaning there's a financing process that takes place where the carbon credit's going to be bought by somebody like Gates? Then the question is, he probably has a whole staff of people who make sure that they check every box to make sure that the credits actually have some value, even if they're only $1 um, uh, per ton, or whatever, the dollar amount per ton of carbon removed, or whatever it is. So I still think that's a nascent industry. It's a fascinating industry that deserves its own podcast, and I'm not qualified to talk about it, but I think it's interesting, and it shows the the inspiration that's gone in around the planet to trying to figure out a way to decarbonize and how to allocate financial responsibility for the decarbonization process across countries, across technologies, across projects.
No, absolutely. And I had to laugh at that a little bit because one of the heads from Microsoft's sustainability group was on a prior episode. Um, so yeah, the carbon credits are one aspect of it, but then we also have things like social cost of carbon and various metrics that EPA puts out that hypothetically a project developer or someone looking to make their project sound as appealing as it is could comment on. So wondering if that's something you guys are seeing or if that's something that could be more of an appetite for going forward as you try to make the case to the Department of Energy or the private funding.
Yeah, well, I think actually, if you don't mind, I'll just go back to the earlier question, which was, do I think that the kind of the implications of not succeeding will, will motivate policymakers and others to kind of, to act. And I think it will because, again, the prize here, let's kind of just not lose sight of the opportunity cost. If we don't fill the ports gap, the wind ports gap in the US, which again is $36 billion, let's say 100 to 120 ports that need to be brought online, not all brand new ports, but a combination of new ports and improved existing ports, then we don't get the $660 billion prize. We don't get the 100,000 plus jobs, green economy jobs, family sustaining jobs that offshore wind will bring. So I feel like it kind of, because it's non-negotiable, I have every confidence it will be solved. Doesn't mean we can kind of rest on our laurels and not kind of continue to push the case for policy changes and other changes, permitting reforms and other things. But we as a business, right, we're confident that this will get worked out. That again, you look at other infrastructure sectors that have had not dissimilar challenges and got through them. And I think offshore wind is, I don't want to say too big to fail because that's kind of used now all the time for everything. But if you think that, long-term clean energy targets are non-negotiable, and then you think that we can only achieve them with offshore wind as part of the mix, alongside solar and others, it's not the only tool in the toolkit, but if we believe that you can't achieve your clean energy targets without offshore wind, then you have to believe that we're going to solve the port gap to bring online offshore wind. So we take a long-term view, Chris. You're not building ports with a 5-10 year outlook. We're looking to 2040, 2050. That's kind of where we're focused. And if you look at the kind of long-term drivers, the long-term fundamentals, they're just getting stronger and more compelling.
Absolutely. And I think too, the benefits potentially of building these types of support infrastructures and getting offshore wind or getting whether it's hydrogen, what other technologies that John will help finance forward and decarbonizing over time, you're going to see other economic benefits by not having as many severe climate impacts. That's one thing that's been stuck in my mind recently, obviously, for the hurricanes in Florida. And I think the metric of $1 billion storm is a little outdated now. We'll probably have to move to 10 billion, fortunately. But I don't like to end these podcast episodes on downers and depressing stuff. And we're coming up on a little bit of a hard stop here. So I want to give you guys each a chance to do some final thoughts. And also, if you have any suggestions for resources that listeners might be able to pull up, and keep in mind that a large chunk of our demographics are students in college and grad school looking into going into decarbonization, clean energy, possibly finance careers. Is there any potential advice you have for them?
I'll jump into that one because I've got a son who's a recent college graduate who majored in environmental science and is looking to get involved in the decarbonization effort in general. And I think what I've learned from him is that there are two types of firms that are out there for people that are listening. There are technology firms that are looking for young people to get involved early on and then stick with the company as they raise a series of rounds and then ultimately commercialize their technology and deploy it. And then there's sort of the consulting side, which Christopher, you know a lot more about than I do, but I'm seeing a lot of the major consulting firms, like the Deloittes, for example, or the PWs or McKinsey, et cetera. They all have decarbonization initiatives, and they're reporting on what they're doing on the internet and on LinkedIn. So you can basically look up almost every major consulting firm in the United States or in the UK, in Europe, and they're all out there with their own vision of how each one of these technologies is going to evolve. And to me, that's exciting because instead of having to make it up as you go along, having the reassurance of being able to work with consulting firms that can really look at the incredible detail they need to really look at, for example, what is it going to cost for different industries to decarbonize? What are those cost curves, as people used to say? I still think that one of the reasons why oil and gas is stiff-arming the world and saying, we're trying, but we're really not making that much headway is because they can't continue to make the profits that they're making if they spent a significant amount or portion of their time not making oil and gas refinery products, but instead putting full-throated investments to work on sustainability and decarbonization and renewables. And maybe that's obvious to all the listeners, but to me, that's something that when I think about how hard it is to go out and raise capital from institutional investors, one thing that would really help that out would be if the strategic incumbent players in oil and gas and chemicals and a bunch of other industries that are continuing to carbonize our globe would put their own capital, their own balance sheet, and their own ingenuity and technologies toward trying to solve this problem rather than just pay lip service to it.
Look, Chris, I just say, firstly, I think folks coming through, trade schools, universities right now, high schools, couldn't be doing so at a better, more exciting time when it comes to renewables and particularly offshore wind. Myself and many of the folks that I meet and work with in offshore wind all came to offshore wind indirectly. There wasn't an offshore wind industry when I left university. I was living in Australia, and there just doesn't have an offshore wind industry, right? Nor did the US until relatively recently. There's folks kind of joining the workforce now, and they can get their first job can be in offshore wind. It's quite a really interesting time for folks, and offshore wind. It's got it's multidisciplinary. It's got all components to it. You could be on the technical side, so engineering, could be on the environmental, you could be financial, you could do social sciences and work on kind of community engagement. So there's a plethora of opportunities. It's a really exciting time to be kind of joining and entering the workforce. offshore wind, I'm not kind of selflessly plugging offshore wind here. This applies to renewables more broadly, but it is an industry that's here to stay. Whatever the short-term political, whatever way the short-term political winds blow, we've got right now 15 gigawatts of projects permitted federally. You can't take permits back, right? So, they're through the gate. The industry's here. Whatever way the wind blows, I think offshore wind will continue to move forward and continue to grow. And I think, it's a sector amongst others. I think folks should kind of have a serious look at because it's such an interesting space to work in. You're just constantly problem solving.
Absolutely. And I think that point you just made, Jonathan, is a great way to wrap on just the opportunities that are there, whether it's offshore wind, hydrogen, whatever decarbonization sector and model you want to talk about, there's opportunity there. And it makes me think when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do out of college, I wanted job security and I wanted to try to help the environment. So getting involved in climate change and permitting and air quality seemed like a logical step. I would encourage any student who's currently listening to this to try to have the same type of inner dialogue and try to gather as much info as you possibly can. And just know that although these topics can be daunting at times and can appear overwhelming, that we are definitely on more of a positive trajectory. And as Jonathan and John both echoed a few times here, there's a lot of opportunity out there. So with that, I want to say thank you both. This was a great chat. And as always, all podcast episodes are available on like a zillion platforms, but especially on LinkedIn. I post the first and it goes to Spotify, Apple, et cetera, et cetera. So again, guys, thank you very much. This was fun.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Great to be with
John.
you. Thanks, Jonathan.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.